Well, welcome everybody to episode 4 of our This Cycling Life webinar. We're going to get started in just a second. We're seeing people now coming on to the call. The response has been absolutely fantastic this week, over 350 registrations from more than 20 countries. So we're going to wait a little while to allow people to come onto the call. During the call itself, because we have so many registrations, we're not going to be activating your video or audio, but of course we would love you to be interacting with us. So we will be looking at the Q&A box. We have both chat and Q&A, but we will ask you, if you do want to ask us questions, please use the Q&A box because we're not great at multitasking. So we're going to be focusing on the Q&A. I'm Jamie Anderson. I'm an academic, a speaker, an author, and of course, a cyclist. What I'd like to do is invite into the video my co-hosts, Allan Davis and Mick Rogers. Mick, would you like to say a quick introduction to yourself, please?
Hello, everybody. Yes, my name is Michael Rogers. I'm part of the Team NTT Pro Cycling Performance team and also have quite a long history in professional cycling.
Over to you, Allan.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of This Cycling Life. I'm Allan Davis, living in the north of Spain in the Basque Country. I'm a former professional cyclist, now coach and also technical advisor at the UCI.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, guys. So as always, with This Cycling Life, what we do in the week or so before our webinars is we reach out to our followers and we ask you to send us your questions. So today what we're going to be doing is focusing on 3 specific questions that we've received from our followers recently from different places around the world. But of course, we'll also be open to any questions that you want to pose to us, whether that's around preparing for events or competition, whether it's about being in peak form or anything to do with tactics or balancing, of course, this work, family and sporting passion that we have. So why don't we just dive right in? And what we're going to do is actually start with a question that we received from Jens in Germany. Mick, do you want to read this out for us?
Sure. More than happy to, Jamie. As you mentioned, from Jens from Germany, what is your advice to succeed with a breakaway? Is there anything different I should know about successful breakaways in the Masters ranks? And, well, Professor, is Professor Albie there? Jamie,
well, let me call Professor Albie and see if he's available. Professor Albie, are you there? We've got a call we think is a question that's very relevant to your experience. Oh, here he is, hey, Professor Albie.
Hello, everyone. How are you all? Welcome.
Now, Professor Albie, I would like to just add one thing to this question. I know there was a cyclist, Allan Davis, and he was an expert at the reverse breakaway. Could you maybe explain what the reverse breakaway means?
That's a very good question, Jens, and also yourself, Michael. Yes, Allan was he made it a fine art of getting in the breakaway that went out the back of the peloton, especially on the days when there was a sprint day and an opportunity the day after in a Grand Tour or a Tour. He saved a lot of energy by doing this, and a lot of times he come up with the goods the next day. So very well pointed out there, Michael.
That's interesting, guys. So, this is interesting. I've been cycling. I've been around the cycling world for more than 20 years, and this is actually the first time I've heard of the reverse breakaway. And Mick, was it something you'd ever practiced in your career?
I practiced it a few times. In my career, but I think we should get to Jens' question. The breakaways moving forward are better than those going out the back.
Going out the back. Well, why don't we jump right in? Professor Albie, why don't you talk us through, how to, practice the fine art of a breakaway?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question and topic, especially what I've seen now in the Masters category racing and also the amateur style Grand Fondos, et cetera. The breakaway can go at any time of the race, so to speak. So it's a lot different to what we're used to back in the pro days. So first advice I can give is to really know your competition. Going back to the research that we mentioned on other webinars, knowing the course, knowing the competition, this will become a huge asset to you when not only getting into a breakaway, but once you're there, knowing what's ahead in front of you.
Yep. And Allan, I guess, this is something that you and I do all the time. If I'm heading off to one of these UCI Grand Fondo World Series races, qualification races, even the World Championship, we study the course months in advance, but we don't just study the course, we also study the riders, right? And an example of that was earlier this year, when we went to the UCI World Series qualifier in Casablanca. We got the course several months before. We saw it was relatively flat, but also very importantly, we saw the starter list, right? And we very quickly identified certain riders that we should be tagging, in the race and very early on in the race. Yeah. Can you talk about that as well, Professor Albee? Because, in master cycling, the breakaways can often go very early. So what's the tips and advice you would give to people there?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one because, masters events, for example, very individualized events, right? There's not many teams involved with them. And if there are, there's sort of a group of guys who talk together, right? So know your opposition and, follow the stronger riders that you think will go in a breakaway. Not only that, know the dynamics of the race, and a lot of times you guys are racing in a mass start, a lot of different categories. So you are racing with younger athletes, so to speak. So don't be afraid to use that to your benefit, to get on the back of them if they do make a breakaway. Yeah. Don't be afraid to take in all those benefits that could help you get the best result possible.
Yeah, very important point. And again, if we go back to Casablanca in February, at the end of February, the person whose name stood out to me the most on the start list, I didn't just look at the Masters guys in my age group category. I looked across the categories, and in that race was Maxime Pirard, a Belgian, who's the current 19 to 34, age group world champion. He was the person that actually I was tagging during the race because he was likely to be the strongest, most aggressive rider. So I wasn't actually following the other 50-year-old guys. I was following someone who was 24 years old, and that actually paid off for me because he attacked very early on, and I was ready to follow that attack, which I guess relates to the next part of the question, Professor Albee, which is training for the hardest parts of the race. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, all your training, in sense, will help you to get in a breakaway or maintain being in a breakaway. Specifically, the explosive training that we do will help you to anticipate a breakaway or follow a breakaway. You're going to have to push out high numbers for a short amount of time, and then once you get into that breakaway, you will find you'll have to click the other switch and save energy, right? So you need to. Yeah, it's a tricky element, but all your training, in sense, will assist you in being a good breakaway rider.
And Jamie, you just touched upon it just now, your breakaway in Casablanca. Why don't you dig into that a little bit? How did you, once you got into the breakaway, because you've told me the story, can you maybe share that? Because you spent a lot of energy to get into the breakaway. Yeah. And how did you look after yourself once you reach the breakaway? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. I guess, Mick, for me, the breakaway started on the start line. Because I saw that Pirard and actually several other former pros were in that race, and given the profile of the course, Allan and I knew the breakaway could go from the start line. It could go from 4 or 5 Ks in. So for me, the breakaway actually started on the start line, and I was right at the front of the grid. I got myself in the front of the grid. And then in that first 5 kilometers, I stayed in the first 10 riders, watching very closely those guys, especially Pirard, who I knew was likely to go. So for me, it started at the start line, pretty much. Pirard did go, and he went around the 5K mark with a guy called Patrick Coquet, another former pro, a Belgian. So I was ready to respond immediately, but they still raced past me, if you know what I mean. So they had a gap on me. So to jump across to them, I produced around 950 watts for around 15 seconds, just to bridge across. For those who are interested, I've written a little blog post about the race, and I'll give some watts per kilo numbers and stuff like that. But that was the kind of explosive effort that I had to do just to bridge onto their wheels. Yeah.
And the dynamics, once you got into the breakaway, dynamics of those riders, you were four riders. Yeah. Was there communication between you? Was there fighting? Was there a sense of teamwork?
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of talking going on for the first 15 minutes, right? Because, first of all, there was that 15 seconds for me to bridge across. Then I did about a minute and a half at over 500 watts just to hold the wheel because they were absolutely driving that brake. I'm on the back at that point. Then the next 10 minutes was somewhere over 300. This is normalized power. So then for 10 minutes, it was 300, 320, something like that, just to, again, stay with them. So honestly, after that 10 minutes, I was not in any sort of condition to jump on the front and start driving the brake. So I communicated to the guys that, look, guys, you know, that's just taken a lot out of me. I'm here with you. I will work, but I'm going to need a little bit of time to just recover. And they were okay with that. They were okay. I was with them. But then I started eating, drinking to replenish some of those glycogen stores, which had been burnt in that first 10 minutes of effort. Yeah.
And what language did you speak in?
Well, you know, I was in a breakaway with two Flemish guys, so that was helpful for me because I speak a bit of Dutch. The other guy, the fourth guy, Kistowski, he was a Polish guy, but English speaking. But honestly, we didn't talk that much. We were just riding, but very quickly we saw that Kistowski and of course Pirat are super strong. And we realized that myself and Cocoit were probably the two weaker riders in the group. And Cocoit and I spoke with each other that we were not going to try to match these young guys who are half our age in this breakaway. Yeah.
Another good point, I think, to our audience is, Jay, that I seen in Albi in the World Grand Fondo Championships a couple of years ago, where the events were set off in waves, right? The categories were set off in waves. So you could essentially get in the early breakaway and then catch the next wave of riders in front of you and all of a sudden becomes another can of worms, right? You have another peloton to use off. Can you explain a little bit about that situation as well?
Yeah, so again, I mean, if you talk about 2017 and Albi World Championships, the Grand Fondo World Championships, the guy who won my age group classification was a guy called Bruce Bird from Canada, super strong guy. And he crept off the front very early and a lot of people didn't even see him go. And what he was able to do then was drive really, really hard to catch up to the younger age group in front of us. So that's a unique breakaway situation because it's not just you as an individual or a small group away. You can potentially link up with other riders. So super important point, Professor Albee, that sometimes that going early in that break is about picking up groups in front of you. I've had similar situations happen at the Cape Town Cycle Classic, where I was in a race group, a masters race group. We actually caught up to the group in front, changed the dynamics completely. Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah. Can you talk to us, Professor Al? Because one of the things that, you know, when I started getting coached by Allan Davis, you know, he talked to me about the importance of understanding my capabilities, not just in terms of my, you know, 5-minute or 10-minute or 20-minute FTP, not even my hour FTP, but what my body could do over 2.5 or 3 hours. Can you talk about this and what it means in terms of the energy systems, the glycogen stores?
Yeah, I mean, let's put it into the breakaway element. That's exactly right, Jay. That's what we did with you, you know, just to know your numbers. So in this example, once you get into the breakaway, you know you've spent, you mentioned over 900 to 1,000 watts to get in the breakaway. Yeah. That takes a lot of glycogen cells to, you know, to burn, to be able to do that. So then the next thing you want to do is to try and save and trying to get some more glycogen back in by obviously your food and intake of your liquids. But knowing your numbers will help you assess what's in front of you. For example, in the situation, you know, there could be another 80 kilometers with undulating terrain, a bit of wind. You know what you have to do to save your bullets for the end of the final, like what I went into in a previous webinar. You know, you have a certain amount of bullets. The amount of bullets you can save, the better off you are later on in the race. So knowing your numbers will help immensely for this.
Yeah. Well, it's also about controlling your emotions, because sometimes it's so easy just to get into, I'm in the breakaway, there's a great chance I'm going to win. And you start to push up against your personal limits and your barriers. Yeah. And within maybe an hour, you're sitting, you know, you're parked up on the side of the road. So you've got to control your emotions in breakaways.
I've seen this many times before, Mick. You know, I was in one of the Grand Fondo World Series qualifiers in Cyprus a few years ago. I was well, actually wasn't, there was a small group in front of us of about 4 guys. So I was in the second chase group. And I looked around that chase group. There was about 10 of us in that group. 8 of those guys were in their early 20s, mid-20s. There was another Swedish guy who was like me. He was a master M4, you know, mid-40s. that guy, the Swedish guy, was matching these young guys in that chase group, right? Because he's caught up exactly in the emotion that you're talking about. What was I doing? I'm saying, look, these guys are not in my age group classification. All I'm interested in is survival here, because also the 3 guys out in the front breakaway are not in my age group classification. So all I was doing was sitting on the back for the ride and eating and drinking. And at one point I actually said to this Swedish guy, I said, listen, mate, you don't need to be doing what you're doing right now, because we've got 2 more days of racing to follow from this one. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Mick. You've got to think very much around survival, what your capabilities are. The Swedish bloke, but he finished that day, but the next day he was dropped on the first climb. He'd burnt all his matches on the first day, and for no reason whatsoever, actually. Yeah.
Worst case scenario of the breakaway is you can simply go back to the peloton.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, so you need to be a bit of an economist to be in the breakaway. I think you need to be able to distribute the energy, or Allan, as you said, the bullets you have, you need to distribute those over the entire length of the stage.
Yeah, we used to, what I coach as well, you assess the situation, Nick. You assess the situation with all the information you have at hand, who's in the breakaway, how far have we got to go, what's left in the profile, what's coming up tomorrow if it's a stage race. Assess all the information, and the calmer you can do this, the better it will be. The more realistic, the more clarity you'll see with assessing all this information.
Yep. And also, of course, we should mention, Professor Albie, that, when I have big races, Professor Albie is often there with me. Allan Davis is there with me. Giro Sardinia that I won a few years ago when I won the Masters classification, Allan Davis was following me on a motorbike a few 100 meters behind, and he was telling me, Jamie, cool it. You don't need to be working this hard. Eat, drink, think. Now, for the first couple of years I was working with Professor Albie, Allan Davis was often at races with me. Now, when I was racing, like in Casablanca, Allan wasn't there with me physically, but I could certainly hear him in my ear, because he had been instilling in me all of these things that we've been talking about. And of course, the thing that I was hearing the most in that breakaway was only work as hard as the least hardest working rider. Right? Professor Albie, can you remind our listeners why this is so important and how it actually helps you to deal with aggression? Because you can get shouted at, you can get abused in a breakaway situation because tempers are running high.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you have to, like I said, you have to assess the situation, and one of those levers that you pull while doing this is, working out who's driving the breakaway and see who's not driving the breakaway, see who's being very smart, see who's being very calculated in judging his or her effort during the situation at hand. So you want to just you want to assess the situation. And if you do pinpoint someone doing that, you want to work just as hard as that person is doing. So later on in the stage, or when it comes down to getting the result from the day, you have as much energy saved as possible to react on whatever situation it may be, whether it's a sprint or you may see an opportunity to break away yourself solo in the last kilometers. So if on the flip side of that, if you've been driving the breakaway for a couple of hours you've been, really nervous and you've really wanted to stay away from the peloton more than the others, you come to the situation and your energy is depleted, so you don't have as much capabilities to react, and the other people will actually benefit from your mistakes.
Yeah, so it's very super important point. And again, going back to Casablanca, I was running all these scenarios in my head, right? Because the other possibility was when we went with this breakaway at the 5 kilometer mark, we had 110 kilometers to go. So I was also hedging in case we did get caught by a smaller group, that I would still have some of that glycogen left for the sprint. And this is super important. What we also talked about last week, which was the drift, right? In our last webinar, we talked about the drift. So when I was in that breakaway situation, whenever we came, it wasn't, there were no real climbs in the race. It was relatively flat, but there were a few little ramps. So whenever we came to those small ramps, or when I saw those small ramps coming, I would move to the front. I would make sure that I moved to the front, took my turn, so that I would hit those little ramps at the front. Even at the front of 3 or 4 riders, it makes a difference, because that little ramp of maybe 100 meters, 150 meters length, I can still drift. I can still conserve a little bit of power. So that was another tactic. And then, of course, the other thing is I did not do any more of those explosive efforts. When Pirat attacked us, I did not chase him myself. I looked at the other guys, because if I had have done another explosive effort, then 20 kilometers into the race, my glycogen stores are absolutely obliterated, right? So it's constantly, working out how much have I got left, particularly with regards to the glycogen stores, and being as conservative as possible. And that's what I've learned from, Allan Davis over the last 3 years. It's not the rider with the best legs that wins the race. It's often the rider who uses his head the most. And Mick, you want to you've talked to us about that many times as well.
Absolutely. I mean, the breakaways, to me, it's almost a double-edged sword. It's really nice to get out there and in the breakaway, but you are, compared to the group, you are expending so much energy. I mean, if we just look at the aerodynamic advantage of staying in a group where the aerodynamic chain is, could be hundreds of riders long.
Yeah.
When you're in a group of 3, 4, 5 riders, you're going to do a lot more work. You're going to consume a lot more calories or energy per kilogram of body weight compared to someone in the group.
Yeah. True. Actually, that relates to a question. So we've had a question from Andy Bruce, and Mick, maybe you can talk to this one. What are the indicators to look for in a break that's likely to say this group will stay away? If it's an early break and you're in that break, what are you looking at to say, look, you know what, I think we've got a good chance this group will last the distance? Maybe you can speak to that, Mick, and Allan.
Sure. If it's an early break, I'd be looking at the riders.
Yeah.
I'd be looking at the composition of the breakaway. Are they the strongest riders? Have they got a background of being able to sustain, a long effort out there for hours? I'd be looking for your time trial guys that can, really keep that power up. Jamie, I don't think you're a fantastic guy to follow in the breakaway. I have to be honest, because you're that punchy type, right? You're that, that short, and you just sit on the back, from what I understand.
You can see in this photo here, actually, which I posted to the question, that's me on the back, and that's pretty much where I was for about 70% of that breakaway. Yeah, you're right there, Mick. Thank you. Thanks for reminding people of that.
Pleasure.
No, I think as well, Mick, just topping up what you were saying, body language is a huge one. Just be aware of the signs of body language. If you can tell in this situation, there's some really strong guys, the way they're riding, assess on how far it is to the finish. If there's a climb, if there's not a climb, if there's a bit of wind. Yep. Body language is a huge one to tell, to see if you don't know the guy, to see how they're looking and how you feel they're looking. So keep an eye out for all those signs, and then assess the situation, like I said.
Yeah. Well, it's a difficult one. It's a really difficult one to answer, because the Masters racing, it's such a different dynamic compared to, what you'll see in the professional ranks. The professional teams, they have riders that will be dedicated to close the breaks. Yeah. They've got domestiques. Whereas in the Masters racing, it's a complete different kettle of fish, because you have the stronger guys showing their cards very early on the race. Yeah. Taking advantage of all the variables that we've just talked about here in this last 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And also, you do talk to other people. I mentioned I spoke to Patrick Cocord, who was my co-breakaway companion, and he said, this Kostowski, he's just out of a pro contract, super strong guy. We're on for the ride. He knew this guy. I didn't know who the guy was, but he knew. And I will often do that in a breakaway. If I'm with a group, I'll speak to my companions. Who is this guy? What's he? What's he likely to do? So you can check in with that. I don't recommend Googling your breakaway companions when you're actually in the event. I know a lot of guys race with their mobile phones, but it's a bit tricky to kind of Google and ride at the same time. So you've got to try to do your homework a little bit in advance. Last question here before we move on to our next topic. There was a question coming in from Blaine Crozier talking about breakaways, and when you're in this small group, in a way it turns into almost like a team time trial. So he was asking there, is it useful to kind of, if you are the breakaway kind of person, to be training in a way for TTs, because that's in the nature of what it is. Well, certainly in my case, Blaine, that's part of the reason also I made it into that breakaway in Casablanca, because I had been training over the winter specifically for the time trial, which I actually won on the Friday. So my 20-minute normalized power was kind of through the roof, because that's really what I'd been training for. And that's why I think I was able to really successfully bridge across, stay in that break comfortably for that incredible hard first 15 minutes. But your perspective on that, perhaps, Mick?
I think that's sound advice. I always see the breakaway as there is that 10, 15 minutes of just, are we going to get away? Are we going to, that violent effort before the break settles. So before the peloton starts to say, all right, that break's going to stay. There's that 15-minute effort where, you really try to increase the gap. So you need to be able to pass that. And you can be the best time trialer in the world, but if you can't pass that 15-minute violent effort, then, there's a high probability that you'd be better off back in the
that's why, when I were talking to Allan about this topic, he said, put the picture of the watt bike in there to remind people about power,
Yes.
getting on, doing that work often indoor, which is what we've talked about, that really high intensity stuff, not just your nice tempo, sweet spot work. You've got to be prepared for those violent efforts. Look, we should move on, guys. Just the last point we'll make here is that when it comes to masters racing, and this is what I'm always reminding myself, and I've said it again and again in previous webinars, is that you are a masters athlete and you're racing for your age group classification. And it's nice to have the glory of an overall finish, but the risk there is, as we said, you get caught up in the ego stuff. So, whenever I'm in a breakaway, I'm always looking around. Who are the other guys in this breakaway and who's in my age group classification? And if I see that there's only one person or maybe no people in my age group, if there's nobody in my age group, which was Casablanca, I'm sitting pretty. I'm just there to survive to the finish, hedging my bets in case we get caught. If I'm in a group of 6 or 7 and I see that there's 2 other guys in my age group classification, it's a whole different scenario, because I've got to be playing that game to beat those 2 guys, not the other 6 in the ride. So that's very important. Keep your ego in check. And the other thing, Mick, Allan, we've spoken about this so often. Don't get aggressive. Being aggressive towards other people, abusing people, swearing, it's just not cool. There's no need for it. It's a bike race. It's there because we all love what we do. So, please, guys, don't get tempted to get aggro when you're in a race, breakaway or otherwise. So let's move on. Let's move on to our next question. Actually, we have a question here related to recovery, which of course is a big part of it for everyone. So this question comes from Christine in Great Britain. There are lots of recommendations about post-race recovery. What do you believe are the most effective ways to recover after an event? Mick, do you want to have a shot at that one?
Sure. Thanks, Christine. Recovery. I have a kind of a bit of an old school overview on recovery. I know there's a lot of strategies coming out now. At the end of the day, a lot of them come back to carbohydrates. So maybe Christine, I can just walk you through exactly what I found to be the best. Which is, as soon as you finish your race, as soon as your effort, you've crossed the line, you clipped out of your pedals, you're off to the side of the road. Maybe you have your family member there. Just simply get them to bring a very simple fluid drink with simple carbohydrates. So what do I mean by simple carbohydrates? You want they're maltodextrins, simple sugars. You don't want any complex sugars. And you want that literally as quick as you can. If it can be 10 seconds after crossing the line, the better. Because what you want to do is you want to literally slam those simple sugars straight into your, or consume them so they can start to get down and replenish those glycogen stores within the muscles and also, of course, your liver, where glycogen is stored.
This is interesting, Mick. Yeah. I mean, I just butt in there, mate. Like, we work through our professional years with, highly educated nutritionists and scientists in this field. And we were always told, and what I coach nowadays is there's a window of opportunity, right? It's like
Exactly.
half an hour to 3/4 an hour max, straight after you finish your event.
There is that kind of 45-minute window of opportunity where you want to get
where your body absorbs, right?
Exactly. It's open, that window is open and it's ready to it's craving these simple sugars.
Exactly.
And I just want to retouch on the simple sugar. The simple sugars will be absorbed faster. So if you start to add in fiber, if you start to add in fatty content, that will simply just slow the absorption down of those simple sugars. So at least in that first 40 minutes, 45 minutes, you want to keep away from anything that's going to slow down the absorption of the carbohydrate.
Jeez, Mick, you've just blown my post-race recovery apart, because normally I just go straight from the finish line through the drive-through at McDonald's, man. When I've done 160K, I'm starving. I want to get something down. So,
you can have that later. You can have that later, Jamie.
Oh, geez.
Yeah.
Good,
you can have that later. But let me go on to step 2. If you have the possibility, you should do a little bit of riding after you do finish as well. Just a simple warm down. You see some people jumping onto home trainers. It's also just okay to continue riding, and maybe after the finish line, after you've had your drink. My tip here is just to have a little bit of variation in your speed. Don't just turn your legs at 20 or 30 or 40 cadence. Try to get out there 10 minutes, do a little bit of variation of speed, because what you want to do is you want to flush that lactate that you accumulated during the sprint to the line. You want to flush that out as quick as you can.
Good point.
The risk here is if you do not flush that lactate out, there is science out there that demonstrates that if you don't flush that lactate out, even at 10 o'clock that evening, you can still have muscles full of lactate, which inhibits the recovery process.
Yeah, there's some excellent stuff. I read an article, academic study a few weeks ago, actually, from the University of Loughborough in the UK, that said that this lactic acid pooling can actually damage or destroy mitochondria, which is absolutely not what you want. So super important to flush that out, whether it's a road race or certainly track events where it's super explosive, short, not just to get off the track and then sit down, right, to get your legs kept turning over. Mick, can you talk to us then about the protein? I told you about my drive-through McDonald's adventures sometimes after a hard one. So you've got your simple sugars in, you've spun your legs out, flushed out some of the lactate. What then do we need in terms of the proteins?
So that's a good question. Yep. Again, once we get to about the 14, so here we're at time 45 minutes. So 45 minutes to an hour after the race, you want to have another hit of sugars. Maybe they can be a little bit more complex. And here you want to introduce your protein as well, because the carbohydrate and the protein, they'll go down in together and then continue the replenishing of the glycogen in your liver and in the muscles as well. Very important point, and you need that protein. The protein to start to get in and repair those broken muscle cells as well.
And we had a question coming in from Ankush Sharma about, should I take a hot bath, a shower, a cold bath? What's recommended then after you get back to your home or your hotel room?
Well, I don't have a lot of experience with heat. Some people talk about jumping into very hot environments. I have quite a lot of experience on ice. Ice baths, cold baths, with the aim of decreasing that core body temperature. Particularly in the summer months, when you're out there racing for 2, 3, 4 hours, your core body temperature is actually rising, and you want to get that down back to your normal temperature as quick as possible. And that, a cold shower, cold bath, if you have the possibility to do an ice bath, that can really bring that temperature down quite fast.
Yeah. I think another tip that we used to do in the professional teams was during the summer months where it's really hot, the slushies in the team buses, a lot of the teams are having the ice slushies. That's really, really quick way to bring your core body temperature down. Little tip.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, it's an interesting one. When you look at, again, when you look at the science on recovery, we have Dr. Josh Miller, who's one of our contributors to This Cycling Life. We have a 20-minute video on really the science of recovery, where he sort of busts some of the myths. The important point here is there's two aspects. There's physical recovery and then there's mental recovery. So when it comes to the physical recovery, definitely the ice, the compression, that can help. Not hugely, but it will help you. When it comes to stuff like stretching, there's very few scientific studies that actually demonstrate that stretching after a race helps you with recovery. And some studies will even say it inhibits it if you overdo it, because your muscles have already been under stress. And by excessively stretching in terms of passive stretching, you can even create little micro tears and stuff. So go very easy on stretching after your race or competition. But the other thing with cooling down your body is it will help you with sleep. Because to get off to sleep, your body needs to reduce your core body temperature. So by getting into a cold bath or having some cold water immersion, it's not necessarily that it helps your muscles specifically, but it will help you with your rest and a better night's sleep. I hope that makes sense. And that's also with stretching. Stretching is great if you do it very gently, because it's one way just to calm your mind. Some people do yoga. So you've got to always think about that. There's two aspects: physical recovery and then mental recovery. Mick, can you talk to us a little bit about the carbohydrates? We also had a question coming in from people had a couple of questions about what kind of foods do you recommend for the protein? What kind of foods would you recommend for carbohydrates in the evening, especially for these multi-day kind of events?
Sure. You want to, particularly stage races where, you're backing up day after day, you want to have a meal in the evening that's quite rich in carbohydrates. Of course, there's a preference. A lot of the riders have a preference towards pasta. Some will like rice. But if you actually look at the absorption of the carbohydrate, your rice is going to absorb a lot faster than your more complex carbohydrates that are in a pasta. So a lot of riders will prefer to have rice in the evening compared to maybe pasta in the morning when they're preloading. Looking into proteins, I personally don't have any preference. I mean, if you enjoy chicken, if you enjoy white meats, if you enjoy red meats, I mean, for me, it's down to preference. I mean, I don't think it has to be so strict. You need to be able to have something that's palatable, something that's enjoyable.
Yeah. Again, I think we've talked about this on previous webinars. The preference is always for whole foods. Try to go for try to go for whole foods, not too much processed bars, mixes, whatever it might be. Go for whole foods. Always.
Okay.
We actually had a question come in. Allan, maybe you're going to touch on this. We had a question coming in saying that there's often talk in the sporting world about pre or post. Should you be doing certain activities in a horizontal position with another person, if you know what I'm saying? There was a question coming in there from Peter in Australia. I don't know. Do you have a perspective on that? Does that sort of horizontal activity with another person after the race help or hinder recovery? What do you think?
Post or pre?
The question was post.
Post. Well, whatever floats your boat, Jamie. I'm not far into this question, but I will say have a system that is sustainable. So don't have a recovery system that you can do long term, not just after one event. So if that includes that protocol, go for it. And if it helps, do it. I have another question on the back of this actually for you, Mick. A lot of our audience here are masters athletes, amateur athletes. When should we be having our first cold beer?
So do you really want to know the truth about some of the proteins?
I think we should move on.
Really?
I think we should. I think we should.
Really,
in a lot of people's mind.
I mean, no, really. A beer, I've seen some of the top Spanish teams, when you go into their bus, I mean, we sometimes go into the bus and say hello between the riders. I've seen beers in the fridge. I don't know whether the bus drivers or the actual riders.
I can second Nick through my Spanish 10 years.
Yeah.
Yep.
Maybe, I'm sure we've got some Belgians on the call, and we all know that the best beer in the world comes from Belgium. So I'm sure there's some Belgians there who can give us some tips and tricks and advice that we can share with our audience later on. But I think this is super useful. As we said, what we will do is after every webinar, we provide our show notes together with our friend Sean Rolls in Sweden. We'll put some stuff in the show notes about some recommended foods and some little bit more detail on some of the topics we've talked about here. We also, in those show notes, we always put some links to some of these academic studies, some of the work by Josh Miller, who we mentioned. We'll put those in as well. Why don't we move on to our last question? I'm conscious of time, where time is going past very, very quickly. So, Allan, why don't you read this one out?
Yeah, this one's from Peter in Australia. I've recently taken up cycling in my mid-40s after a 20-year career in the corporate world. When I am out on the bike, I often feel guilty that I should be working and being productive instead. Is this normal? Any tips on how to overcome this and it? Jamie, I think you're the one here to perfectly answer this question, mate. This has affected you personally, and I think you have some good experience to tell us.
Yeah, I mean, terrific. Thanks, Allan. And thanks, Peter, for this question, because actually I think this phenomenon that you're talking about, Peter, is you're not the only one. There's so many people that I talk to, when I'm out running executive workshops, working with corporates, who talk to me about this. And by the way, not just cyclists. I've had this kind of question coming from runners, from triathletes, but also not just around sport, just relaxing in general. People say, I just have trouble slowing down because I feel I should be working all the time. So let me just touch on it, I think quickly, because what we have to understand here fundamentally is there's two kind of people in the world, right? One kind of group of what we call these type A personalities. And I think, Peter, you probably fit into this bucket if this is an issue for you, because type A people are really ambitious. They like to be organized. They like to win, and they're proactive and anxious. So they're juggling the balls, at a really high level all the time. So this is the personality that tend to struggle. The type B folks, they're ones who are a little bit more relaxed. They can slow down. They can stop and smell the roses. They don't have to be competing all the time. The psychology stuff shows that these kind of people have less of an issue with this phenomenon. All right. So that's the first thing. Understand if you are one of these type A personalities, right? So what I'm talking about here is point one, which is understand yourself, right? And consider why you're feeling guilty. Does that make sense, guys? Mick, Allan? I mean, does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. I mean, guilt, I struggle with it. I really struggle with it because I've been in part of my career as a cyclist. I felt guilt when I didn't train. Yeah. But now I've kind of 4 years ago, I stopped and moved into a kind of more normal life, like an office hours work style, particularly with the team. I'm the opposite. I feel guilty if I don't go out and exercise.
Yeah. Okay. That's an interesting one, right? Because in a way, exercise has been part of your career for so much of your life. You feel guilty when you don't. So that's a super interesting point. How about for you, Allan? Because, you also work hard. You're juggling the balls of your different entrepreneurial ventures, you're coaching. But you still like to ride, right? But do you ever feel guilty when you get out on your bike?
To be honest, Jay, I'm a bit the same as Mick with this. During my career, guilt was definitely a factor of when I wasn't training or when I wasn't doing what I thought I should be doing. I used to get guilty and used to react to it. Yeah. Nowadays, mate, going out on the bike, it helps me immensely from a lot of angles. My mental space. I get guilty if I don't go out now. So I get more enjoyment out of my cycling now more than ever, because it's when we go out on our bike, it's just for cycling for what it is. The hormones it releases while we're out there, the clarity it brings, not only while we're out there, the ideas and work you actually come up with while thinking.
Which is super important. Which is super important, which is, I'll talk through, and what I'll actually share with you is just a few of these tips and relate exactly to what you guys are saying, because there's actually like psychology research on this stuff, and there's even a term for it, right? They call it leisure guilt. So it's not just cycling guilt, it's just leisure guilt in general. So the first thing, as we've talked about, understand why you're feeling guilty. Are you a type A or B personality? If you're a type A kind of person, this is likely to happen to you. So just acknowledge, this is the kind of person I am. I'm likely to have these feelings. Related to that, however, is you need to step back a bit and say, look, is riding my bike really negatively impacting my work performance or my family relationships or whatever it is? And often the answer is no, right? And we'll come to some of the positives in a moment. So you've got to step back for a second and say, look, does it really negatively impact other aspects of my life by riding my bike? All right. If the answer is yes, then you've got to ask some other questions. But secondly, then what this is about is priorities, right? Because for many of us who've been in the corporate world, what's been the priority? To get promoted, to earn more money, to be recognized, to move on to the next project, to win the next deal. And that can become habitual in a way. This drive towards earning more, getting recognized more, winning more, it becomes a habit, and habits are hard to break, right? So what you then have to ask yourself is, what is really meaningful for you now in your life? And for me personally, around 2010, I was at the peak of my career professionally, but I wasn't feeling fulfilled. So the question I asked myself was very simple. I said, look, when I get to the end of my life, when I'm on my deathbed and I look back on the things that really mattered to me, would it be a promotion, the money that I earned, the deals that I closed? No, actually, probably what I'm going to look back on is those times I spent with my family, the people that I loved, and my sport, right? So what I then sort of decided was I'm going to make some decisions and actually downgrade work and the importance of work in my life, right? But that was a conscious decision. Now, that also had consequences, because that means I consciously decided I was going to earn less. I was going to work fewer hours and so on. So my message here is you have to make a choice about your priorities. And if you love your cycling, if it gives you a lot of pleasure, then that's okay, even though you don't get paid for it, right? Now, of course, I'm not ignoring the reality. You've got to pay the bills, right? So you've also got to look at some of the practicalities there. But, Allan, you and I, in 2017, when we decided that I was going to go for the World Championships and have a huge year, you know what that meant, right? You know what that meant. I mean, maybe you want to talk to the people about what that meant in terms of the hours of training and the commitment.
Yeah, I mean, this is going back to what we've spoken about on previous webinars, of being able to juggle one's ambitions in life, whether it's work and career commitments, family commitments, this passion for cycling, and much more. The ability to be able to juggle this and go forward in setting. I'll go back to also what we mentioned about goals. In 2017, the goal was more cycling orientated for you in particular, Jamie. But knowing this, we had a macro goal of years down the track that 17 was more cycling orientated, but the year after was going to be more career work orientated.
Yep.
So don't be afraid to set macro goals, long-term goals, and then break it down from there. And then you can really get a clear understanding and a purpose for what you're doing, whether it's with your family, your work, or your cycling.
Great point, Allan. Again, it comes back to this personality type. If you're one of these type A people, you want it all and you want it now. So what actually happened to me, and it has happened to me over the last 10 years, is I've become a bit more of a type B person. I've become a bit more relaxed. I've become a bit less demanding of myself, and I'm much more satisfied to look at those longer term horizons, not to want everything this year, not to want everything all the time. Because what I actually believe is when it comes to juggling these three balls of your career, your family, and yourself, you can't have all three of them high in the air at the same time. You can have two of them up there, your sport and your family, but then the work has to come down a bit. You can have the work and your sport, but then maybe your family will suffer. So you've got to juggle those a little bit. Now, just on the other point, you two guys mentioned downtime. Again, in my field of leadership, one of the things we understand is that the most successful leaders make time to think, because when you're super busy all the time, your frontal cortex is overstimulated. So you're not actually taking the time for introspection and reflection. So we do need downtime, and you can take that downtime on your bike. And that's not about riding hard all the time. It's about easy riding, just relaxing. The other thing there, and again, we've talked about it on other episodes of This Cycling Life, is that the research shows that cycling actually boosts your cognitive performance. And it does that by releasing dopamine, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. There's lots of evidence to show that aerobic exercise, particularly in that sort of zone 1 and 2 level, is incredibly beneficial for your brain performance. So if you're under high stress and you've got problems to solve as a leader, cycling is one of the best ways to boost your performance in your brain. And finally, I mentor about half a dozen C-level executives. 2 of those guys are also, as it happens, cyclists. One of them, who's also a very good friend of mine, a guy called Herman, a CIO of a large pharmaceutical company here in Belgium. He makes time to ride his bike at least 1 or 2 days a week during the day. So he doesn't try to cram it in by riding before work or after work. He will go out at 10 o'clock in the morning till midday on a Tuesday. His team knows it. His employees know it. His personal assistant knows it. Everybody knows it because they know that that's when Herman does his thinking. He's working, actually. So what I'm saying here, and what the research shows again, is actually in many ways, cycling is not potentially going to damage your success or your career. It's actually going to enhance it and improve it. And anecdotally, I also get lots of messages on this from people. People saying, I get my best ideas when I'm out on the bike, which is what you talked about, right, Allan? What you do when you're out on your bike. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, it's amazing the clarity and the great decisions you make, for us cyclists while we're out on the bike. This is a really good example in the business world, by managing the balance by introducing that cycling, no matter what time it is during the day, but the benefits is not only your physical benefits, but it's your mental benefits in your work and decisions is going to be in a better place because of doing this. So that's a very interesting point, and I think it relates to a lot of us now.
Great point, Allan. Mick, you want to say something?
No, I mean, I have more dumb ideas than good ideas, but most of my good ideas have actually come on a bike. So that's my input. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Mick. Thanks for that. Look, I'm aware of the time. It's been fantastic. We had some great questions coming in. Very quickly, there was a question from someone about a foam roller. I don't know about foam rollers. Are they good for you? They're not good for you. Again, what I will do is I'll post that question to Professor Josh and we'll get him to respond based on his knowledge of recovery. So I'll come back on that question. Sorry we didn't get to talk to it directly. But thanks a lot to everyone. Very quickly, of course, we would like to say a thanks to our friend Mitch Docker at Life in the Peloton. He's a great supporter of This Cycling Life. If you haven't looked at his podcast, please do so. Of course, you see the 3 of our faces every time we join you in this webinar, but there's a other very important person we'd like to mention, and that's our colleague Ramandeep Singh. Ramandeep is sitting in Mumbai. He's supporting us behind the scenes with all the technical stuff. We're also super happy because Ramandeep has a watt bike arriving at his apartment in Mumbai shortly. He's getting on the bike and we're going to have a new project to announce very soon. The partner for that project will be a guy that many of you will know, who is Alexei Gediwal, who was the first person of Indian ancestry, Sikh American, who won a gold medal at the 1984 Olympic Games. So we want to involve Alexei also on future episodes of the show. With that, of course, what we would also like to do is encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you've got another question or follow-up, please do connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram using the hashtag #ThisCyclingLife. And as we always do, we'd like to finish with some words of wisdom. So, Allan Davis, what are your words of wisdom to close this webinar?
Only work as hard as the least working rider in the breakaway.
Thanks, Allan. And Mick?
It doesn't happen in training. It's not happening in racing.
And of course, the advice from me always is your hard days are only as good as your easy days. So thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on a future episode of This Cycling Life.